For 7 years, everyone in Millhaven thought I was dead. Not missing. Not unreachable. Dead. My own obituary ran in the Millhaven Gazette on a Tuesday morning in March, 6 years after I left. I didn't see it until much later, but apparently it was well written. Said I died of a heart attack somewhere in rural Guatemala. Said I was survived by my son and my brother. Said I was a man who gave his life to building things for people who had nothing. That last part was true at least. I left Millhaven when I was 53 years old. My wife had passed 2 years before. Ovarian cancer, fast and merciless. And I didn't know how to be in that house anymore without her. Every room still smelled like her. I'd stand in the kitchen at 6 in the morning making coffee I didn't want to drink, and the grief would just sit on my chest like a stone. My son was 24 then, grown, working. He had his life ahead of him, and I was just a hollow man rattling around a 4-bedroom house with too many memories and not enough reasons to stay. A former colleague reached out that fall. He was running a construction and infrastructure project in the highlands of Guatemala, building water systems, roads, schools, and villages that hadn't seen clean water in generations. He needed experienced project managers, men who knew how to work with their hands and lead a crew and solve problems when the nearest supply depot was 3 hours of bad road away. I said yes the same day he asked. Before I left, I sat down with my son and I told him everything, the bank accounts, the deed to the house, a property I'd owned outright since paying it off the year before my wife died, a 4-acre lot with a workshop and a barn that I had built up over 20 years. The house was his. I put his name on the deed alongside mine. I told him my brother would help him with anything he needed, because my brother had always been steady and reliable, or so I believed. I told my son I didn't know exactly how long I'd be gone. A year, maybe 2, long enough to feel useful again. I hugged him at the airport. He told me to be safe. I told him I'd write. That was the last real conversation we had for 7 years. The project kept expanding. 1 village became 3. 3 became a regional initiative. We were building schools and then training teachers. We were installing water filtration systems and then teaching locals to maintain them. The work was endless and it was good, and I was needed in a way I hadn't been needed since my wife got sick. I wrote to my son every 2 or 3 weeks at first. Long letters, handwritten, because internet access was unreliable, and phone calls went through a satellite system that cost more than most families out there earned in a week, and even then the connection dropped every few minutes. I wrote about the mountains and the food, and the kids who showed up every morning to watch us work. I asked about his life. I asked what he was doing with the house. After about 8 months, the letters stopped coming back. That part I have to be honest about. And I was wrong, and I knew I was wrong even then. And I told myself a story about it that let me keep working instead of stopping and getting on a plane. I told myself the mail service was unreliable from his end. I told myself he was young and busy and not much of a letter writer. I told myself my brother was there, and if anything was seriously wrong, someone would get word to me through the organization. I should have flown home. I know that now. I knew it then, and I chose not to face it. Part of me was afraid of what home would feel like without his mother there. Part of me had found something in Guatemala that felt like purpose, and I didn't want to lose it. Those are explanations, not excuses. I understand the difference. The letters I kept sending went unanswered. I sent 17 of them over the following 6 years. Every single one was intercepted before it reached my son. I learned that later, but for 7 years I didn't know that, and I kept telling myself it was distance and silence and the way grief sometimes makes people go quiet. I was a coward about it. I'll say that plainly. Whatever my brother did, I gave him the conditions to do it by staying away and not pushing harder to find out what was wrong. I came home on a Wednesday in late October. No one knew I was coming. I hadn't told anyone, partly because I didn't have reliable contact information anymore, and partly because I wanted to see the house first. I wanted to understand what I was walking back into before I announced myself. I took a bus from the airport to Millhaven and got off 2 blocks from the property. The walk took me past the hardware store, where I used to buy lumber on Saturday mornings, and the diner, where my wife and I ate breakfast every anniversary, because she said their French toast was the best thing she'd ever put in her mouth. The town looked the same. I felt like a ghost moving through it. The house didn't look the same. I stood at the end of the long gravel driveway and just looked at it for a minute. The fence along the south pasture was half collapsed, with wire sagging between posts that had clearly been rotting for years. The paint on the house was peeling badly on the north side. There was a rusted truck parked near the barn that I didn't recognize, and the workshop I'd spent 3 years building by hand, had a padlock on the door that wasn't mine. There was a man in the pasture. He was maybe 30, lean and worn-looking, carrying feed buckets toward the small paddock near the barn. He moved with the kind of tired efficiency that comes from doing hard physical work every day for a long time. He was wearing a gray work shirt with the sleeves rolled up, despite the October chill. I watched him for a moment before I recognized the way he walked. The slight leftward tilt when he was carrying something heavy, the same way his mother used to walk. My chest did something I don't have a word for. I called out to him. He turned and looked at me the way you look at a stranger who's wandered onto your property, cautious, not hostile, just waiting to see what I wanted. He didn't know me. I don't know what I expected. 7 years is a long time. I was 60 now, not 53. My hair had gone fully white, and I was thinner than I'd been, and I'd grown a beard in Guatemala because no one cared whether you shaved out there. But I still expected something. Some flicker of recognition. There was nothing. "Can I help you?" he said. I had to clear my throat before I could speak. "It's me," I said. "It's your father." He went very still. I watched him look at me the way you look at something that doesn't fit into any category you have. Not quite disbelief, not quite recognition, something in between. His jaw moved, but nothing came out. "I know," I said. "I know I owe you an explanation." He set down the feed bucket slowly, like he needed something to do with his hands. Then he said quietly, "They told me you were dead. We sat on the tailgate of that old rusted truck for 2 hours. He told me everything, or everything he knew. His account of the last 7 years came out in pieces, not chronologically, the way people tell you things when the story is too painful to organize. After I left, my brother had started coming around the house more and more. At first, it seemed like he was just checking in, the way I'd asked him to. He helped with small things. He gave my son advice about maintenance, about money, about decisions. He made himself indispensable the way some people do, slowly, helpfully, until you can't see the shape of what they're actually doing. About a year after I left, my brother started mentioning that he'd heard nothing from me, that the organization I'd gone to work with couldn't find any record of me. He seemed worried. He made calls, he said, and showed my son printouts that said the project I'd been working on had ended and no one knew where I was. The letters I'd sent, my brother had been intercepting them. I found out how later from the organization's records. He'd had my mail forwarded to a P.O. box he controlled by filing a forwarding request and forging my signature. Every letter I sent came to him. He read them, presumably, and then destroyed them. My son never saw a single one. About 18 months after I left, my brother told my son I was dead. He produced a death certificate. I have no idea how he obtained it or had it made, but it looked official enough that my son, who was 25 and grieving and didn't know what questions to ask, believed it. With me declared dead, my brother moved quickly. He filed paperwork claiming that the property had outstanding debts, liens I'd supposedly accumulated before leaving. The paperwork was fabricated, but it looked real, and my son was young and didn't have a lawyer and didn't know to fight it. My brother told him the property would have to be sold to cover the debts, unless he could come up with a significant sum of money very quickly, which of course he couldn't. What my brother offered instead was an arrangement. He would acquire the property to protect it from foreclosure. My son could continue living and working there. He wouldn't have to leave the only home he'd ever known. In exchange, my son would manage the property, the land, the livestock, the maintenance, and any income from the land would go to my brother to cover the alleged debts. My son, at 25, with his father supposedly dead, and his mother 3 years gone, and no one else to turn to, agreed. For 6 years he had been working his own inheritance like a hired hand. He said it so matter-of-factly, sitting there on that tailgate, that it took me a moment to understand the full weight of it. He wasn't crying. He was past the point where that kind of thing makes you cry. He just told me like it was a fact about the weather. "I didn't know what else to do," he said. "I was trying to keep the house. I had to look away for a minute." "You were," I said. "You were keeping it. You did the right thing." He was quiet for a moment. Then he said, "Uncle told me you'd gotten reckless in your old age, that you'd made bad investments before you left, and then run away from the mess." I looked back at him. "Is that what you believed?" He took a long time answering. "I didn't know what to believe," he finally said. "But I kept the house. I want to tell you about my brother, because he's the villain of this story, and I think it matters that you understand he wasn't always. We grew up in the same house, ate at the same table, went to the same schools. He was the one who taught me to throw a baseball. He was at my wedding. He held my hand in the hospital the night my wife died. I don't know when the jealousy started. Maybe it was always there, and I just never saw it. Some people spend their whole lives looking at what someone else has built and calculating what they think they deserve instead. My brother had always had more opinions about my property than seemed quite normal. Asking about the value of the land, asking what I planned to do with the workshop, asking once whether I'd thought about selling the back acreage. I'd always deflected those conversations without thinking much about them. I thought about them now. I stayed in a motel that night rather than in the house. Not because I didn't want to be near my son, but because I needed to think clearly, and thinking clearly required distance from what I'd just learned. I called the organization I'd worked with in Guatemala from my motel room. They had records. They had copies of my personnel file, my project logs, my communications. They had documentation that confirmed I had been an active employee and contractor for the entirety of the 7 years I was gone, alive, working, traceable. That documentation would matter. I called a lawyer in the morning. Her name was Constance Fruel, and a colleague in the organization had recommended her when I told him over a satellite phone what I'd come home to. She was based in the city, an hour from Millhaven, and she had a particular expertise in estate fraud and property disputes that made her exactly the right person. I drove to her office and sat across from her desk and told her everything. She listened without interrupting, which is a skill that not enough lawyers have. When I finished, she was quiet for a moment. "The death certificate is fraudulent," she said. "Yes, the property transfer is fraudulent. Yes, and you have documentation confirming your whereabouts for the past 7 years. The organization has everything." She nodded slowly. "This isn't complicated," she said, legally speaking. "What your brother did constitutes fraud, forgery, elder financial abuse. He filed false legal documents to seize an asset that belongs to you. The property never legally transferred because he had no standing to acquire it under the circumstances he manufactured. We can have this in front of a judge within 60 days. "I want it done right," I said. "No mistakes." "There won't be any," she said. I told my son that evening what I was doing. He'd spent the day working. He still went out and did the work every morning, because the animals needed care regardless of anything else, which told me something about his character that made me proud and sad in equal measure. We sat at the kitchen table, which was the same table we'd had when his mother was alive. He'd kept it. He'd kept a lot of things. I told him I'd spoken to a lawyer and that I intended to get the property back and that his uncle would be held accountable for what he'd done. He was quiet for a moment. Then he said, "What happens to him?" "That depends on what the law decides," I said. "But he committed fraud, multiple counts. He forged a death certificate and used it to steal a property. Those are serious crimes." "I know," my son said. He wasn't asking me to go easy. He was just sitting with it. The fact that the man who told him his father was dead was his father's brother, someone he'd known his whole life. "I just wanted to understand what you were thinking." "I'm thinking about you," I said. "I'm thinking about the 6 years you worked this land that was already yours and didn't know it. I'm thinking about the letters you never got." He looked down at the table. "You wrote letters?" 17, I said. "One every 4 months or so." He was quiet for a long time. "I thought you just left," he said. Not accusatory, just honest. Not at first. But after a while, when nothing came, I started to think maybe you just decided not to come back. That one landed hard. I'd expected it to, and it still did. "I should have done more," I said. "I should have come back when the letters stopped being answered." I had reasons for not doing that, and they were real reasons, but they weren't good enough. I want you to know I understand that. He looked at me for a long time. His face is his mother's face around the eyes and my face around the jaw, and it was strange and good to sit across from him after all those years and see both of them in the same place. "Okay," he said finally. "Okay." It wasn't forgiveness exactly. It was something more like the decision to begin. The legal process took 58 days. My brother didn't surface immediately. When he did, when he was served with the civil complaint and the accompanying criminal referral, he hired a lawyer and filed a counterclaim, alleging that the property transfer had been a legitimate business transaction and that I had no standing to contest it because I had abandoned the property voluntarily. His lawyer was not as good as Constance Fruel. We had the organization's records. We had 7 years of project logs with my name on them, time-stamped, filed with an international NGO that had no interest in this dispute. We had the metadata from the mail forwarding request, my name, forged, on a form that had been filed from a UPS store 3 miles from my brother's house. We had a forensic document examiner who testified that the death certificate was produced using a template that had been in circulation on the internet since 2019. My brother sat across the courtroom in a gray suit and didn't look at me once during the proceedings. The judge was a woman in her late 60s with reading glasses on a beaded chain, and the manner of someone who had seen every variety of human dishonesty and was not impressed by any of it. She listened to both sides. She reviewed the evidence. She asked my brother's lawyer a series of questions that his lawyer struggled to answer. Then she ruled the property transfer was void. The fraudulent death certificate was referred to the district attorney. The back rent and labor that my son had effectively provided to my brother over 6 years, labor on property that had always legally belonged to my son and me, was calculated and ordered to be repaid. I won't tell you the exact number. It was significant. My brother didn't have it in cash, which meant liens against his own property to satisfy the judgment. He said nothing when the ruling came down. He just stood there in his gray suit looking at a fixed point somewhere above the judge's head until his lawyer touched his arm and they walked out. I moved back into the house in January. My son and I spent 3 weekends that winter tearing off the peeling siding on the north face and replacing it with new cedar boards. The fence along the south pasture took another 2 weekends. The workshop padlock I cut off with bolt cutters the first day I was back, which was maybe unnecessary since we had full legal possession of the property again, but it felt important to do it with my own hands. He still lives here. He took the bedroom down the hall, the one that used to be his growing up, and he's made it his own. He started a small operation raising and selling quarter horses. He has a good eye for them, better than mine. We eat dinner together most nights. We're learning, slowly, to talk about the years in between. Some mornings I stand in the kitchen making coffee, and I think about the stone on my chest that sent me to Guatemala in the first place. It's still there, in a way. Grief doesn't disappear, it just changes shape. But standing in this kitchen now, with the sound of my son moving around in the other room, the stone is lighter than it was. I don't know what the lesson is, exactly. Or maybe I do, and it's just not the kind of lesson that fits neatly into a sentence. I know that staying away is never as safe as it feels. I know that the people who love you need you to be present, not just accounted for, and that being reachable is not the same thing as being there. I know that I gave my brother both the motive and the opportunity, and that understanding that is part of how I live with it. And I know that the first time my son called me from across the property last spring, just hollering across the pasture to ask whether I wanted to drive into town for lunch, I had to stand there for a moment before I could answer because something in my chest just broke open in the best possible way. Yeah, I called back. Give me 5 minutes. He waited.